At an upscale dining establishment overseen by a merciless proprietor, patrons are treated unequally based on their outward appearance. One day, a destitute man dressed in ragged, worn clothing enters the venue, and no one greets him except for one individual, a struggling African-American waitress who works tirelessly just to make ends meet. She is the only person who extends a gesture of kindness toward him. However, unbeknownst to her, this man is not who he seems, and by offering her assistance, she is on the brink of completely altering her life in ways she could never have anticipated. Before we delve deeper, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. We will be delighted to hear them. Nestled in the bustling heart of New York City, where towering skyscrapers cast long shadows over the streets below, stood the magnificent Pearl, a restaurant famed for its opulence, exclusivity, and clientele who never had a glance at their bank accounts before placing an order. The atmosphere inside was rich with the enticing aromas of gourmet cuisine, the soft murmur of polite conversation, and the delicate clinking of fine china against marble tabletops. This was a venue where wealth spoke volumes, where service was impeccable yet impersonal, and where the presence of a single outlier could shatter the facade of perfection. Among the staff bustling about in crisp uniforms was Amani Johnson, a young African-American woman with determined eyes and an unyielding spirit. At just 25 years old, she had already come to understand that the world did not easily dispense kindness, especially not to individuals like herself. Each day, she navigated the unspoken rules of this establishment, where guests were treated like royalty, while employees were expected to remain invisible. She was no stranger to long hours, aching feet, or the condescending sneers from both patrons and management alike. Yet, none of this mattered, especially when there were bills to pay and, more importantly, a mother waiting at home who was battling an illness that showed no regard for how many shifts Amani had to work to afford her medication. Her boss, Marcus Blake, ruled the restaurant with an iron fist. A tall, broad-shouldered man in his 50s, his perfectly tailored suits and slick-back hair exuded an air of importance. However, his true nature lurked just beneath the surface. Marcus was a man who valued appearances above all else, who you were, how much you were worth, and most significantly, whether or not you fit into his narrow definition of respectability. His employees were merely replaceable cogs in a machine, and his disdain for anyone who did not conform to his rigid standards was evident in the way he spoke to them, the way he regarded them, and the way he subtly reminded them that they were beneath him. It was just another evening at the Grand Pearl when the routine was disrupted. The doors swung open and a man stepped inside. Hector Ramirez, a figure so out of place in this realm of luxury that the entire room seemed to stiffen at his arrival. His clothing was old and tattered, his hair unkempt, and his shoes worn down to their soles. He carried himself with an unusual blend of humility and quiet confidence, as if he had once belonged in places like this but had long been forgotten by them. The moment he entered, whispers spread like wildfire among the guests. A few turned away in disgust, while others shot expectant glances toward the staff, waiting for someone to remove him before he could tarnish the atmosphere with his presence. Marcus, who had been surveying the dining room from a bar, narrowed his eyes in irritation. He despised situations like this, a homeless man wandering in, thinking he could linger in a place like the Grand Pearl. It was detrimental to business. He glanced toward the host's stand, expecting his staff to handle the situation, but to his annoyance, no one made a move. Then, before he could intervene, Amani stepped forward. She approached Hector with a neutral expression and a calm voice. "Good evening, sir. Welcome to the Grand Pearl. Would you like a table for one?" The murmur of disbelief from the other staff was almost palpable. Marcus clenched his jaw. This was precisely why he found Amani insufferable. She was too soft, too willing to offer kindness where it was undeserved. Hector, for his part, appeared pleasantly surprised. "Yes," he replied, his voice deep and steady, as if he hadn't just been treated like an outcast by half the room. "That would be nice." Amani led him to a small table near the back, away from a VIP section, but not so far as to seem like she was trying to hide him. As she handed him a menu, Marcus stormed over, his forced smile barely concealing his irritation. "Amani," he called. She turned to face him, her shoulders straight. "Yes, Mr. Blake?" Marcus leaned in, lowering his voice but ensuring his tone conveyed a warning. "We don't serve as kind here," he said through clenched teeth. Amani's stomach twisted, but she maintained her neutral expression. "He's a paying customer, isn't he?" Marcus scoffed. "You think he has money?" He cast a disdainful glance at Hector, who had begun studying the menu with quiet interest. "Be realistic, Johnson. People like him come in here to beg, not to buy. Don't waste my time with this nonsense." Amani met his gaze with quiet defiance. "If he orders and pays, he's a customer like anyone else." Marcus exhaled sharply, clearly aggravated but unwilling to cause a scene in front of the guests. "Fine," he spat. "But if he causes trouble, he's your problem." With that, he stalked off, muttering something under his breath about wasting time on nobodies. Amani turned back to Hector and offered him a polite smile. "Can I get you something to drink?" "A glass of water would be nice," Hector replied, a knowing gleam in his eyes. As Amani moved to fetch it, she felt the stares, the silent judgment radiating from the other staff, the way some of her colleagues whispered among themselves. But she ignored them. It was her job to serve without bias, without cruelty, and if that made her an outsider in this establishment, then so be it. Hector took his time with the menu, his fingers gliding over the edges of the laminated pages, his eyes darting between the options. When Amani returned with his water, he offered a small smile. "I think I'll have the soup of the day and some bread," he said. "Nothing too fancy." Amani nodded. "Good choice. Would you like anything else?" Hector considered for a moment before shaking his head. "No, that should be enough. Thank you." As she left to place the order, Marcus shot her a smug look from across the room, as if to say, "Let's see how this plays out." His expression seemed to imply that he was eager to observe just how long her little act of charity would last before Hector embarrassed himself. But Amani was unfazed by Marcus's thoughts. She had witnessed plenty of people come and go in this restaurant. Plenty of wealthy individuals who treated the staff like dirt, plenty of people with money but no humanity. And yet here was a man dressed in rags, carrying himself with more dignity than half the so-called elite who dined here. She didn't know who Hector Ramirez truly was, but something told her that this night was destined to change everything. As the evening unfolded, the Grand Pearl continued with its usual rhythm. Servers glided between tables, balancing trays of extravagant dishes, and glasses clinked as affluent patrons toasted their successes, oblivious to the struggles of those who served them. Amidst the polished elegance of the restaurant, Hector Ramirez sat quietly at his table, seemingly unbothered by the curious glances and hushed murmurs directed his way. He sipped his water slowly, his weathered hands resting lightly on the table, waiting patiently as if he had all the time in the world. From across the room, Marcus Blake kept a watchful eye on him, his lip curling in disdain every time his gaze landed on the man's tattered clothing. He had spent enough time in this business to recognize trouble when he saw it, and in his mind, Hector was nothing more than a nuisance, a stray who had wandered in hoping for a free meal. He had no intention of allowing the night to conclude with this man making a fool of his establishment. If Amani wanted to waste her time serving him, fine, but the moment Hector so much as hinted that he couldn't pay, Marcus would ensure he was thrown out onto the curb where he belonged. Amani, on the other hand, was focused on performing her duties. She moved efficiently, slipping in and out of the kitchen, ensuring Hector's order was prepared with the same care as any other guest's. When the chef handed her the bowl of steaming soup and a small plate of freshly baked bread, she took a moment to steady herself. She was aware of what everyone was thinking, that she was wasting her energy on a man who likely couldn't even cover his bill. But Amani had always believed that dignity was not something earned through wealth. It was something everyone deserved simply by being human. And tonight, regardless of what anyone else thought, she would ensure Hector was treated with the dignity he deserved. Returning to his table, she set the meal down carefully. "Here you go, sir. Our soup of the day is potato leek, along with some warm bread. Let me know if you need anything else." Hector looked up at her, something unreadable flickering in his eyes, then smiled. "Thank you, young lady. This looks wonderful." Amani gave him a small nod before stepping back, allowing him to enjoy his meal in peace. She had seen enough guests in his restaurant to discern the difference between those who ate mindlessly and those who truly savored their meals. Hector was the latter, He took his time with each spoonful, his eyes closing slightly as if memorizing the flavors. He ate with a patience that was rare in a place like this, where customers were accustomed to indulgence rather than appreciation. While she was clearing a nearby table, a sharp voice sliced through the air. "Are we really allowing this to happen?" Amani turned just in time to see one of the regulars, an older woman draped in expensive jewelry, gesturing toward Hector with a look of distaste. She wasn't addressing anyone in particular, but her voice carried, ensuring the entire room could hear her displeasure. "I spend thousands of dollars in this restaurant every year, and now we're just letting anyone off the street?" Amani's hands tightened around the empty plate she was holding. Another man chimed in, his voice dripping with amusement. "Next thing you know, we'll have beggars lined up outside expecting free meals on the house." A few guests chuckled, and Marcus, sensing an opportunity to put an end to this, straightened his tie and strode toward the table. "I completely understand your concerns," he said smoothly, flashing a placating smile. "I assure you, the Grand Pearl maintains the highest standards. I will personally ensure the situation is addressed." He turned to Hector, his expression shifting from polite professionalism to thinly veiled hostility. "Sir, I trust you're enjoying your meal?" Hector, who had remained unbothered by the conversation up until this point, looked up from his soup, his expression neutral. "Very much so. The soup is excellent." Marcus's smile didn't reach his eyes. "I'm glad to hear that. Now, I assume you have the means to pay for it." Hector wiped the corners of his mouth with his napkin, taking his time before responding. "Of course," he said simply, reaching into his pocket for a brief moment. For a fleeting instant, the restaurant seemed to collectively hold its breath. Even Amani, who had been standing just a few feet away, felt an uneasy tension creep into her chest. Hector pulled out a handful of small bills and loose change, carefully counted them out on the table. $1 here, a few quarters there, a crumpled 5. Slowly and methodically, he arranged the coins and bills into a neat little pile. Then he exhaled, looking at the amount with quiet understanding. "I seem to be a little short," he admitted, his voice calm, almost amused. "I thought I had enough, but I must have miscalculated." The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus let out a sharp, triumphant breath, as if this was a moment he had been anticipating. "I knew it," he sneered. "This is exactly why we don't allow—" "I'd be happy to work for it," Hector interrupted, his tone composed. "Perhaps I can wash dishes in the back. I don't mind a little hard work." Marcus barked out a laugh. "Oh, please. You think I'm going to let you linger in my kitchen, getting in the way of my staff?" He turned toward the host stand and snapped his fingers. Security. Amani's stomach dropped. 2 men in black suits began moving toward Hector's table. Amani knew them well. The Grand Pearl didn't just hire security for show. These men were trained to remove problems efficiently. No questions asked. "Hold on," she said quickly, stepping forward before they could get any closer. Her voice was steady, but there was a fire behind it. "He's not trying to run out on the bill. He's offering to pay it back with work." Marcus shot her a sharp look. "And I said we don't run a charity." Amani reached into the pocket of her apron, her fingers brushing against a small bundle of tips she had collected throughout the evening. It wasn't much, certainly not enough to cover the kind of extravagant meals a restaurant usually served. But tonight, it wasn't about extravagance. It was about dignity. Without overthinking it, she pulled out the money and placed it on the table next to Hector's coins. There, his bills covered. A hush fell over the restaurant. Marcus's eyes darkened. "You're seriously paying for him?" Amani met his gaze without hesitation. "Yes." Hector looked at her, something unreadable flickering across his expression, then slowly nodded. "Much appreciated." For a long moment, Marcus just stood there, jaw clenched, his pride visibly battling against the reality that there was nothing he could do. With the bill settled, he had no excuse to throw Hector out, at least not without making a scene that would tarnish his image. Finally, with a frustrated sigh, he waved off the security guards. "Fine," he muttered, "but don't let me see this happen again, Johnson." Amani said nothing. She simply picked up the empty soup bowl and walked away. As Hector stood up to leave, he turned to Amani one last time. "You didn't have to do that." She shrugged, offering a small, tired smile. I know. Hector studied her for a moment, then nodded. You have a good heart, he said softly, and good hearts are rare in places like this. Then, without another word, he walked out of Grand Pearl and disappeared into the night. Amani exhaled, the weight of the moment settling on her shoulders. She didn't know why she had done it. Maybe it was instinct, maybe it was defiance, or perhaps it was simply because, in a restaurant where wealth was everything, she had wanted to prove that money wasn't the only thing that mattered. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that this was not the last she would see of Hector. Ramirez not by a long shot. The following morning, the Grand Pearl opened its doors as it consistently did, welcoming the city's elite into its sparkling interior. The same expensive fragrances mingled with the enticing aroma of freshly brewed coffee. The same polished floors reflected the chandeliers above, and the same carefully curated atmosphere of exclusivity hung in the air. To an outsider, it was merely another day of refined luxury. However, for Amani Johnson, the weight of the previous night still lingered heavily on her shoulders. She had anticipated the repercussions. She had known the moment she placed those $5 on Hector's table that Marcus would not let it slide, and she had been correct. Johnson. Marcus's voice sliced through the tranquil lull of the early shift, sharp and impatient. Amani had been setting up a table near the back of the restaurant, but she straightened immediately, turning to face him. He stood by the bar, arms crossed over his broad chest, his expression unreadable, yet his posture was stiff with irritation. Follow me. She didn't argue. He led her through the restaurant, past the neatly dressed waitstaff preparing for the lunch rush, past the gleaming kitchen doors where chefs were already hard at work. Amani had assumed he was taking her to his office, but instead, he stopped just outside the employee break room, a space intended for stolen moments of rest that never lasted long enough. He turned to face her, his cold, assessing eyes locking onto hers. Do you have any idea how much damage you caused last night? Amani blinked, her hands tightening at her sides. Damage? Marcus scoffed. That little stunt of yours, paying for that bum's meal. Do you have any idea how that reflects on this restaurant? We cater to high-class clientele, Johnson. People who come here to escape reality, not to be reminded that vagrants exist. Amani's jaw clenched. He wasn't asking for a free meal. Hector was willing to work for it. I don't run a damn soup kitchen, Marcus snapped. You think those patrons who were complaining last night didn't notice? You think word won't spread that the Grand Pearl is suddenly the kind of place that lets in strays? You embarrass this restaurant. You embarrass me. Amani swallowed back the frustration rising in her chest. I covered his bill. There was no reason to throw him out. Marcus let out a low, humorless chuckle, shaking his head. You still don't get it, do you? He stepped closer, lowering his voice. I don't care about $5. What I care about is the kind of people we allow in here, and I am not going to let you turn this place into some charity project. You work for me, Johnson. You do not make decisions about who belongs here. Amani felt her nails digging into her palms, but she forced herself to remain calm. She had been through this before, though perhaps not this explicitly. Marcus had never needed to state it outright. His actions, his tone, his expectations had always made it clear what kind of people he valued, and which ones he wanted nowhere near his restaurant. And someone like her, a young black woman who had to fight for every ounce of respect in this place, she understood better than to believe she was exempt from his disdain. Marcus exhaled sharply, rubbing his temple as if speaking to her was exhausting. Since you seem to have so much free time to concern yourself with people who don't matter, I've decided to adjust your responsibilities. Amani stiffened. From now on, Marcus continued, his smirk returning, you'll be handling additional cleaning duties, bathrooms, floors, tables. I want everything spotless. Amani knew exactly what this was, a punishment, a way to humiliate her, to remind her of her place. She forced her expression to remain neutral. That's not my job. Marcus tilted his head, feigning confusion. Oh, I could have sworn I was the one who decided what is and isn't your job. Amani's stomach twisted, but she said nothing. Glad we understand each other, Marcus said smoothly, stepping back. Now get to work. Amani turned sharply on her heel, leaving before he could say anything else. The anger simmered just beneath her skin, hot and pulsing, but she buried it deep, just as she had so many times before. She needed this job. She needed this paycheck for her mother. So she swallowed her pride, grabbed a bucket of cleaning supplies, and got to work. By midday, her uniform was damp with sweat, her hands raw from scrubbing tile floors, and her legs sore from hours of bending, lifting, and wiping down every surface Marcus deemed unworthy of imperfection. The scent of bleach clung to her skin, a stark contrast to the rich aromas of roasted lamb and buttered lobster wafting from the kitchen. While the other servers bustled about catering to the elite, Amani remained in the background, invisible, just as Marcus wanted. She had spent the morning silently enduring it all. His smug glances, the way her co-workers whispered behind her back, the occasional patron who sneered when they saw her kneeling on the floor with rag in hand. It wasn't the work that humiliated her. She had never been above cleaning. It was the intent behind it. The deliberate way Marcus had wielded this punishment to remind her that she was disposable, that kindness was weakness, that she had no power here. But even Marcus didn't know Amani as well as he thought he did. She wasn't weak. She was merely waiting for an opportunity to prove it. She had just finished emptying a trash bin near the back entrance when she heard footsteps approaching. At first, she thought it was another staff member, perhaps even Marcus, coming to find another excuse to berate her. But when she turned, she froze. Hector Ramirez stood before her once again, but this time he wasn't alone. A woman stood beside him, Elena Ramirez, though Amani didn't know her name yet. She was younger than Hector, her features sharp and striking, her posture upright and composed despite the way her simple, slightly wrinkled clothes suggested she hadn't enjoyed the comfort of a good night's rest. Though she wasn't as visibly worn as Hector, there was something about her presence that carried the same quiet resilience, the same unspoken weight of experience. They both looked hungry. Amani's chest tightened. "What are you doing here?" she asked, glancing toward the doorway to ensure no one had seen them. Hector smiled, the same knowing, unbothered smile he had given her the night before. "Would you believe me if I said we were just passing through?" Amani gave him an unimpressed look. Elena sighed. "We haven't eaten since yesterday." Amani's stomach sank. She had thought Hector's situation was dire enough, but the knowledge that his sister was also struggling made it worse. Hector chuckled at her expression. "Don't look so guilty, Miss Johnson. You already did enough for me yesterday." But Amani didn't see it that way. Her fingers tightened around the trash bag she had been holding. If Marcus caught her talking to them, she knew what would happen. But she also knew what it felt like to go without food, to watch someone you love suffer because you didn't have enough. She thought of her mother and the nights she had skipped meals just to ensure there was more left for her. Amani exhaled sharply, made her decision, and acted before she could talk herself out of it. "Wait here." She disappeared to the side entrance, slipping into the back kitchen, careful to avoid any wandering eyes. She knew this place like the back of her hand, where leftovers were stored before they were thrown out, which containers were set aside for employee meals, which stations were empty long enough for her to move unnoticed. She grabbed a cloth napkin and, in one swift motion, scooped up a few slices of bread, a portion of roasted chicken that had been plated but never served, and a small container of mashed potatoes. It wasn't much, but it was something. She wrapped the food carefully, clutching it tightly against her chest as she hurried back outside. Hector raised an amused brow when she thrust the bundle into his hands. "Quick hands, Miss Johnson. You sure you're in the right line of work?" Amani huffed. "Just eat before someone sees you." Elena didn't hesitate. She unwrapped the bread first, breaking off a piece and handing it to Hector before taking one for herself. They ate quickly but not desperately, as though they had learned long ago how to pace themselves even when food was scarce. Amani watched them for a moment, that familiar tightness returning to her chest. She was about to speak when a voice cut through the quiet like a blade. "What the hell is going on here?" "Marcus." Amani turned so fast she nearly lost her balance. Marcus stood in the doorway, his expression twisted in fury, arms crossed over his chest. His gaze flicked between Amani and a half-eaten food in Hector's hands, and the realization dawned on him instantly. "Oh, you got to be kidding me." Amani scrambled for words, but Marcus was already moving, stepping forward with slow, deliberate intent. "I knew it," he sneered. "I knew you were a bleeding heart. But this—" He gestured at Hector and Elena with disgust. "Stealing from my kitchen to feed a couple of beggars?" Amani's heart pounded. She was going to be thrown out. "I don't care." Marcus snapped. "That's not the point. You don't get to make those decisions. You don't get to take my food and hand it out like some charity worker." He was livid, and then the words came that Amani had been dreading. "You're fired." The world seemed to tilt for a moment. Amani had prepared for this possibility. She had known she was already on thin ice, that Marcus had been looking for a reason to get rid of her ever since last night. But still, the finality of it hit her like a punch to the ribs. She opened her mouth to argue, to plead, not for herself, but for her mother, for the job that kept them afloat. But before she could get a word out, Hector moved. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a neatly folded stack of bills, and placed them directly into Marcus's hand. The entire world seemed to still. Amani froze. Marcus looked down at the money, brows furrowing. "What the hell is this?" Hector smiled, not the warm, knowing smile from before, but something sharper, more deliberate. "Payment," he said simply. Marcus's scowl deepened. "For what?" Hector tucked his hands into his coat pockets. "For the food and for the lesson you're about to learn." Marcus let out a short, incredulous laugh, glancing between Amani and Hector. "Oh, this is rich. You got this guy paying your debts now, Johnson? You think that's going to save your job?" Hector tilted his head slightly, as if studying Marcus like an experiment whose outcome he already knew. Then, after a long pause, he said something that sent a chill through the air. "Who said anything about saving her job?" There was something final in his tone, something almost amused. Amani didn't understand what he meant. Not yet, but she would. For a moment, Marcus just stood there, staring at the crisp stack of bills in his hand, as if trying to process what had just happened. His fingers twitched, his jaw clenched, and for the first time that evening, he seemed at a loss for words. The anger that had flared so violently just moments ago had dimmed, not because he had suddenly grown a conscience, but because money always had a way of shutting him up. Amani could see it in his face, in the way his mind worked behind narrowed eyes. Hector had just handed him far more than the cost of a few scraps of food. In Marcus's mind, he had won, at least in his own perception. He had gotten what he wanted, money in his pocket, proof that he was right about people like Hector being beneath him. With that, his interest in punishing Amani any further seemed to wane. He exhaled sharply, shaking his head in mock amusement before stuffing the money into his pocket. "Fine," he muttered. "I don't have time for this nonsense anyway." He flicked his gaze toward Amani, his lips curling into a smirk. "But you're still on cleaning duty. You want to play the hero, Johnson? Be my guest. But don't expect any sympathy when you realize none of it was worth it." Amani didn't respond. She watched as Marcus turned on his heel and walked back inside, his posture that of a man who thought he had won. And maybe to him, he had. But as Amani turned back toward Hector and Elena, there was something in Hector's eyes, something knowing, something almost amused, that made her wonder if Marcus had just made the biggest mistake of his life. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "But you didn't have to do that." Hector smiled, a slow, deliberate thing. "I know." Elena studied Amani for a long moment before stepping closer. "We'll see you again," she said, her voice calm and steady. Not a question, but a statement. Amani frowned slightly, confused by the certainty in her tone. But before she could ask what she meant, Hector turned toward the alleyway, and Elena followed. Within moments, they had disappeared into the night. The next evening, the Grand Pearl was at its peak. The dinner rush had begun, and the restaurant hummed with the usual air of exclusivity. Glasses clinking, hushed conversations, and a low murmur of jazz playing beneath the sounds of indulgence. Every table was occupied by the city's elite. Each guest draped in designer fabrics, their laughter laced with the easy arrogance of those who had never known hunger. The waitstaff moved in a well-rehearsed rhythm, delivering plated perfection with forced smiles, while Marcus Blake stood near the bar, watching over his kingdom with the satisfaction of a man who believed he was untouchable. He had barely thought about Amani since yesterday. She had been a nuisance, nothing more, a bleeding heart in a business that required detachment. Letting her go had been inevitable, and though he had enjoyed seeing the shock on her face when he fired her, she was nothing but a footnote now. Employees came and went. He would replace her by the end of the week. Tonight was about business, about profit, about ensuring that the Grand Pearl remained what it had always been, a place for people who mattered. Then the doors opened. Marcus barely glanced up at first. Patrons arrived every few minutes, always dressed in their finest, always ready to spend. But something in the air shifted. A ripple of curiosity spread to the restaurant. Heads turned, conversations faltered, and the room's attention slowly converged toward the entrance, as if something or someone had tilted the balance of the room. Marcus frowned, straightening and finally looking toward the entrance. Then his breath caught in his throat. Hector Ramirez had returned, but he was no longer the man Marcus had thrown out yesterday. Gone were the tattered clothes, the worn shoes, and the quiet presence of a man who had been overlooked. In his place stood a figure of power, wealth, and undeniable authority. Hector walked into the Grand Pearl with the confidence of a man who owned the very ground he stepped on. His suit was flawless, tailored to perfection, a deep charcoal that complemented the sleek timepiece on his wrist. His hair was neatly styled, his posture relaxed yet commanding. The very same guests who had sneered at him the night before now watched him with interest, with recognition, and with the quiet unease that came when the rules of their world suddenly shifted. Beside him, equally composed and equally refined, was Elena Ramirez. She was breathtaking in an elegant dress that accentuated her striking features, and together they exuded an aura of sophistication that demanded respect. In an elegant black dress, her sharp features framed by a confidence that was nearly regal, Elena Ramirez stood out. Where Hector exuded a quiet dominance, Elena carried the unmistakable poise of a woman who was accustomed to entering rooms and commanding them effortlessly. The murmurs in the restaurant grew louder as a few patrons leaned toward their companions, whispering questions to one another. "Who are they? I swear I've seen him before." "Wait, that's Hector Ramirez, the investor." The name struck Marcus like a cold slap to the face. Hector Ramirez. The name resonated with a weight that settled heavily in his stomach. Marcus had heard it before. Everyone in the industry had. Hector Ramirez wasn't merely wealthy. He was powerful, a businessman whose investments spanned continents. His portfolio included luxurious hotels, exclusive resorts, and most importantly, some of the most successful fine dining establishments in the world. And now, he had walked into Marcus's restaurant the previous night, pretending to be nothing more than an ordinary man. Marcus swallowed hard, his mind racing with questions. Why was Hector here? Before he could make a move, Hector's gaze swept across the room and landed directly on him. Marcus stiffened, and to his absolute horror, Hector smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was deliberate and knowing. Hector began walking toward him, every step unhurried, measured, and purposeful. Elena followed closely behind him, and as if the night hadn't already taken a turn Marcus couldn't control, he noticed that Hector wasn't just walking toward him. He was walking toward Amani. Marcus's stomach dropped. She was there, standing near the back of the restaurant, where she had been helping a junior server clear plates, a task Marcus had relegated her to before he fired her, just to humiliate her one last time. She still wore her uniform, but now, as she stood there watching Hector and Elena approach, she looked like she belonged more than Marcus ever had. Amani's brows furrowed. Her expression caught somewhere between confusion and disbelief as Hector came to a stop in front of her. "Amani," Hector said, his voice warm and familiar, as if greeting an old friend. "It's good to see you." Amani blinked, hesitating as she glanced between him and Elena. What's going on?" Elena smiled. "We didn't get a proper chance to introduce ourselves yesterday," she said smoothly. "I'm Elena Ramirez, and this is my brother, Hector." Amani stared at them, taken aback. "Your brother?" Hector chuckled, surprised. "That's an understatement." Marcus's patience snapped. "All right, what the hell is this?" Hector turned to face him, his expression unreadable. Marcus forced out a chuckle. "So let me get this straight. You walk in here last night looking like a homeless man. I catch your little act, and now you're back dressed like—" He gestured vaguely. "What, you think putting on a suit is going to impress me?" Hector tilted his head slightly. "No, but my offer might." Marcus's smirk faltered. "Offer?" Hector's gaze didn't waver. "I'm buying this restaurant." The room fell silent. Marcus stared, then barked out a laugh. "That's the biggest load of nonsense I've ever heard." Elena raised an eyebrow. "Is it?" Marcus's laughter died in his throat as he noticed Elena holding something, a file. She opened it with the precision of someone who had already won the game before the opponent even realized they were playing. "The Grand Pearl," she said, skimming the documents. "Privately owned by Marcus Blake, but with substantial financial backing from external investors." She flipped a page. "Investors who, as of this morning, have accepted our buyout proposal." Marcus's face drained of color. Elena snapped the file shut. "So congratulations, Marcus," she said, her smile sharp and merciless. "You don't work here anymore." Marcus couldn't breathe. He looked at Hector, at the calm, steady way he regarded him, as if he had been waiting for this moment. "You planned this," Marcus whispered. Hector smiled. "Of course." A beat of silence passed. Then Marcus lost it. He turned on Amani, his face twisted with rage. "This is your fault," he spat. "You think you're some kind of hero? You think these people actually give a damn about you?" Amani didn't flinch. She simply looked at him, calm and unbothered. Then she said, simply, "You should go." Marcus clenched his jaw so tightly it looked painful, but he had no choice. With a final glare, he stormed toward the doors and disappeared into the night, leaving behind a restaurant that was no longer his. The moment he was gone, Hector exhaled and then turned back to Amani. "So," he said, smiling, "how do you feel about running this place?" Amani stared at him, then slowly smiled back. Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.